have it to look at it. Okay. So chapter 1 is going to cover what they call reports, the English language, and we'll talk a little bit about this weird thing called police jargon, which is kind of slang terms. And law enforcement is notorious, just like other careers, they have their own slang. If you're in the nursing industry, they have certain things that they call things, or they use certain codes. If you're an engineer, the same thing. I'm sure if you're in digital media, there's phrases and different things that they use. It's the same thing with law enforcement. But when you write your reports, you need to be careful not to use too much police jargon or any at all, because people don't understand it. And it's hard to have to try to explain a slang term on the witness stand when you're testifying in court. So that's just one of those things that you kind of want to be careful of as we kind of talk about police, report writing, etc. Let me move this thing down here. Let's see if I can move this a little bit. There we go. That's a little bit better. Okay. All right. So what we're going to cover tonight and what we hope to learn is to kind of have a basic understanding of the English language and how it applies to police reports, because it's not like your lit class. It's not going to be on a dark, stormy night or something like that. It's going to be a little bit more factual. Okay, we're gonna really work at recognizing the various procedural issues in completing a report, and there are different processes and procedures. We'll take a look at kind of the style and flow and content of a police report, and then we'll kind of look at some of the different exercises that you may have to do. One really important case that I think it's important that you understand, and I'm going to move this. I'm having a hard time figuring out where to put. There we go. This is probably better. One case law is Brady versus Maryland. And this is an important case for you to remember in report writing, because it's a landmark United States Supreme Court case that basically established that the prosecution has to turn over any what they call exculpatory evidence that might exonerate the defendant. So it's not like on TV where you have your stuff and the defense has their stuff and you don't share anything. If you have information that could possibly prove that your suspect is innocent, you can't hide that, is basically what the court case is saying. You have to turn it over. And hopefully that makes sense. And if you don't, there's a lot of issues that can happen besides you losing your court case. But this case is also important because it attaches to officers that write things in the report that are not correct, meaning they're false. So there's something out there in the world of policing called the Brady List. And the Brady List is, anybody heard that phrase before? The Brady List basically is where the defense can bring up factual information about an officer who has intentionally lied in a police report. So when you're on that list, every time you go to court, I mean, there's other sanctions that could happen to you as well. But if you happen to be on this list, then before you even testify, the defense can basically tell the jury, hey, this officer lied in a police report before. And how do you think that's going to make you look when you go to testify in court? It's going to be really ugly. So this is a really important case. And that's why when we talk about report writing, you need to be very factual. You don't stretch the truth. You write the facts as they are, and the case is what it is. So that's why this case is a really important one for you to remember. Also, report writing is basically one aspect of policing, that law enforcement profession, if you will, that most officers look upon with, I got to say it, I wasn't sure if I wanted to really use these words, but it's true. Cops look at writing reports with some kind of dread and reluctance. And anybody want to take a shot on why that is? Why do you think we?
Time consuming?
Okay, that's good. So that's one. Yeah, it's time consuming. If you write a homicide report, it's going to take you a while to write. You might have follow-up investigations to do. Um, some reports we dread more than others, like a sexual assault report tends to take a lot more time. It's a lot more detailed. And some reports get to you, like child abuse reports. They kind of get under your skin a little bit. So that is one thing. Time consuming is one. Any other ideas?
A lot of what's taken to court and what's referenced, and if you miss something or leave it out, it could be huge.
Yeah, you want to make sure that you get everything in there because it's your report. So you might look, not as intelligent, if you will, when you get on the stand. Alec, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just said it'd be a lot of pressure to get things right and make sure that all the information is correct.
Yeah, I mean, so there is some pressure there, and even with like traffic collision reports, not only a lot of these reports that you take might have a civil connection, meaning that somebody's going to sue somebody else. So if you don't have your facts really straight, then it might impact somebody else's suit down the road. And you don't have to worry about that really, but you're going to have pressure from all these attorneys asking why you found their client at fault or why they did this or why they did that. So there's a civil aspect kind of built into some of these reports, especially for traffic collisions and things like that, like who's at fault. So these are all things that we kind of have to look at. But a lot of times, and Zena, I think you said it at first, they're time consuming, and cops would rather go out and have, I kind of hate to say have fun, but they want to go out and arrest people and do that stuff. But then they forget after you do that, you have to write your report and book your evidence and do all your other stuff in order to go to court. So that's not the really cool side of policing. So that's kind of one interesting thing. So with that said, report writing, understand, is an acquired, and I left it blank because I kind of want to know what you think. Report writing is an acquired what that can be mastered in a short period of time.
Skill.
It's a skill. So even the second part, report writing, it's the same thing. It's a skill that's going to improve over time with practice. So, and experience. So when you write your first report, like you're going to do this week, don't worry about it. It'll be what it'll be, and we'll fine tune it. And by the end of the semester, you'll have everything fine tuned. But don't panic, because if you've never done it before, it's going to take you a little time possibly to get it correct. I remember when I was training new officers that a simple burglary report that might take with no suspect information and really no evidence might take a seasoned officer maybe 15 minutes to complete. It would take a brand new rookie maybe 2.5 hours. And because it's their first one and they're worried about what they write and how they write and things like that. So as you go on in your law enforcement career or writing reports, etc., you're going to develop a writing style that's kind of comfortable for you. You'll figure it out, but also complies with whatever agency you're working for, because different departments do things a little bit differently when it comes to report writing. They might have their own forms or an expectation that you put a certain thing into the report where some departments may not. So it is agency specific. So skill. The reality here is that everything starts first with the officer on scene. And that's where all these reports kind of generate from. So every incident. A lot of times there's so much to think about and do as the first officer on a crime scene. So, we have to kind of think about, we talked a little bit about interview and interrogation, but we always have to think about our responsibilities as the first officer on the scene, because at some point we're going to have to write a report. And if anybody recognize the photos?
The OJ Simpson.
Yes. Yeah, it's the OJ Simpson case. So yes, very graphic, and they kind of are what they are. So a couple things to kind of keep in mind. First officer on scene, you're going to have some responsibilities, and we'll talk about a couple of those. But you also have to kind of keep your cool and be able to function when you're dealing with this kind of stuff. Again, it's not always like television. So, but what might be some responsibilities of the first officer on the scene?
Making sure contaminates the area.
Yeah, so that's a big one. You seen crime scene tape? It's the yellow tape that the officers will put up. So securing the scene is a big deal. Anything else?
Your witnesses.
Yeah, checking for witnesses.
security.
Yeah, make sure that, ask around or assign somebody to look for witnesses. That's a big thing. What else?
Like the very first officer on the scene,
Yes.
making sure that any of the victims don't need medical attention.
Medical aid could be another one, sure. And while these photos, I mean, I'm sure the first officers on the scene, when they got there, they probably checked, but a lot of times you can tell based on what you see whether somebody is actually alive or not. But you're not a medical professional, so you're going to need to check closer just to make sure, or roll medical aid just in case. So that's always a big one. So yeah, so there are things that you have to do. You may even have to take some quick notes or something like that. Just remember that you've kind of involved yourself in these situations that require a lot of skill, professionalism, in order to complete your investigation. So take control of these incidents, develop some type of course of action, have a plan on how you're going to kind of run your crime scene and do your reports. And as you get into this more, especially when you get on the job, you'll come up with the way that you do things, kind of a checklist in your head on how you do things. So as the first officer on the scene, your response to these type of incidents, it's not finished until the report is done and everything's been written and submitted. So, that case report, that crime report, that incident report, different departments call them different things. So I kind of wanted to let you know that some departments call it a case report. Your textbook might even call it a case report. Some departments call it a crime report. Some call it an incident report. A lot of times they're the same thing. They use the same form. So even though it might be a suspicious circumstance, you might take that on a crime report that has an incident report block. And I'll show you what that looks like when we get a little bit further down into the lecture here tonight. But just know that sometimes these report names are synonymous with each other. So it may be easy to arrest somebody, but when you do, again, you're going to have to, have a case, a report that can prove that this person did it in court. And it's not always as easy as it looks. And the OJ case is always kind of one of those famous cases that we can look at or go back to. And I know we all have differences of opinion on guilt or innocent, but there were thousands of pieces of evidence. But there were also issues with this report and some of the evidence collection and et cetera. So that really is what kind of broke this case open. So the crime report, the case report, whatever you want to call it, the main report is really critical in capturing every detail of the incident. And this case report is basically an investigative tool that's going to be used to find the suspects and begin to bring about some type of closure. And I'll show you some examples of case reports. So this is a report from Rialto Police Department where I worked. And basically, we called it an incident report, but it's used for crimes too. So it's kind of all encompassing. So a lot of departments will have this, and they might call it a crime report, but you can use it for incidents. But it's got, the top part right here for the location, the date and the time, the offense, which would be the crime, the victim, so any victim information, any suspect information, and if you don't have a name, you might just have a description, whoever the reporting officer is over here. If you have more people, so if you have 2 victims or 1 victim and 2 witnesses, there's usually a form that has for additional people. So you want to make sure that you're capturing all of this information in your report. A lot of these report forms have property that maybe was recovered at the scene, or any vehicle suspect information, any narcotics or drugs or any other evidence. So this is kind of a typical report. And again, you don't have to fill out all of these blocks if you don't have any of this information that's applicable. But a lot of these bigger crime scenes, you might have a lot of information and you're going to put that in these little boxes. And the reason for that is a lot of this is going to be entered into databases for future reference, maybe MO files or comparison of other cases, etc. So that's kind of what a case report looks like. Remember though, this report is also a legal document, so it can be subpoenaed into court. So that's another reason to make sure that you're as accurate as possible. You really have to be able to kind of defend your work product, if you will, because you may be called to court to testify about your report, and there's going to be two attorneys. There's going to be the prosecuting attorney, and there's going to be a defense attorney. And while some defense attorneys are somewhat polite, their job is to get their client off by any means possible. And if that means attacking your report and what you wrote and how you wrote it, then that's exactly what they're going to do. And as we, as it kind of says here, we're going to learn a little bit later that many people are going to look at your report. And again, the defense attorney is going to look for mistakes or errors, not necessarily little, finite spelling errors, but errors that might, kind of play into the defense of their client. So when you're writing your report, always be thinking about your future courtroom testimony, because that's important. So let me ask you a question. Will you be able to look at your report during a court trial? What do you guys think?
Yes.
Okay, why is that?
Because
To jog your memory.
because trial can be years out from when you wrote that report.
Yeah, so a lot of these cases can take, it could be a week, it could be a month, it could be 5 years, it could be 8 years. You'd be surprised how long, and in civil cases, it can last even longer. So a lot of times you may not know the answer to the question. You may not even remember what you wrote in that report. So before you go testify, of course, you're going to go to your own records bureau, check out, you're going to get a copy of your report so you can review it, and you're going to bring it with you to court. So that way, the judge doesn't want you to testify from it, but I heard somebody say it, you're allowed to refresh your memory. So that, it's really important that you review your report before you go. Keep in mind that your report is a permanent record of everything that supposedly transpired at that criminal incident, at that crime scene. And that report also allows others who were not at the crime scene to understand the facts that occurred at the scene because they weren't there. So a lot of times the more detailed you are, the better off your report's going to be. You're going to paint this picture for people. So, and this includes the judge and the jury. And there's kind of an old adage in law enforcement, if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. Because if you testify to something that you didn't put in your report, they're going to ask you why you didn't put it in your report. So, and you have to be able to defend that. It doesn't mean you're going to lose your case over it, but you can see the hassle that it's going to present later on when you have to explain why you didn't think it was significant enough to put it in your report. So hopefully that kind of makes sense to everybody. So who might look at your report? I talked about that a minute ago. Your initial supervisor is going to look at it, because they'll look at it and approve it or kick it back and have you make some corrections or something like that. Your command staff, so captains and the chief might even look at your report. The detectives, if you're a patrol officer and you write a report, that report will go to the detective bureau, and whoever gets assigned that case report to follow up is going to read it. Any officer of the court, meaning the judge, the district attorney, defense counsel, and the jurors on occasions can look at parts of a report. So that's important. And even the media can get a hold of a police report. I mean, they're not supposed to typically, but a lot of times they can get their hands on a report, or somebody gives them a copy, the defense or something like that. So all of these individuals or these groups can get a copy of your report. So just kind of keep that in mind. So when you're basically putting your report together, think about how you would describe all of the activities that took place. Think about the elements of the crime that's going to help your case in court, because all these different crimes have certain elements. If you've taken a criminal law class, you kind of know what elements to a crime would be. So like robbery, it needs to be, the unlawful taking of personal property from another through force or fear. So you have to meet those elements. And if you don't meet those elements in the report, chances are that case isn't going to continue on. Also, make sure that it's written in proper English. Poor word choice really does affect the meaning and understanding of a report. So think about how you say it and the words that you're going to use. Keep it simple. Don't write above your head. Does that make sense to everybody? Don't use all these big words that you really don't understand, because you might have to explain it later, and it's really difficult to do that. The example that I kind of give a lot of times to students would be when you're doing let's say, a field sobriety test to a drunk driver. There are many different tests that you can do, and some of those tests are very difficult, like this. Can any of you recite the alphabet backwards? Yeah, I see people shaking their heads. If you can, more power to you. You're kind of my hero. I can't do that. I'd have to count. I'd have to go through the whole thing and then one letter at a time and stop before the end in order to do that. I don't think I could think like that. Or when you take your fingers, and I don't know if you can see it here. You probably can't. Where you tap your fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. Keep in mind, you're going to have to demonstrate that possibly in front of a jury. So when you do a test, you want to do a test that you can actually do. It's the same thing with writing. When you write a report, make sure that you can explain it and use words that you can explain. Watch your grammar and your punctuation. Punctuation, they really don't hit as hard, but watch your grammar and your tense, whether it's past tense, present tense, because errors in that area could change the meaning of your report. Always ask questions like, how do you know, when you're interviewing somebody, and we talked a little bit about interviewing. Crime scenes. And if you guys have any questions as we're going on, I know this seems kind of basic, but it's okay. It's going to get a little more difficult as we go on. But crime scenes can be chaotic and confusing. We know that because of everything that, depending upon the type of scene. So obtaining correct information is really important. So you may need to clarify. So I put a couple of examples in here. So victim number 1 says, I saw the burglar drive away in a 1995 blue Chevy Impala. Well, that's super descriptive, right? I mean, that's like very descriptive. So, the officer, a good tactic would be, well, how do you know that that's what kind of car it is? Well, I used to own one, or I used to have one, or my neighbor had one. So that's just kind of helping you establish that this person knows what they're talking about. So asking clarifying questions isn't really a bad thing. Again, every agency has a specific format and style that's going to be in their case reports. I showed you an example of a Rialto report. There's some other different examples on that forms page that you can just look at. Again, we want to focus on the common elements in writing a good case report. That's kind of our goal for this class. So let's talk a little bit about some basic principles and putting your report together. The first would be thinking about the style. So your report should be written as kind of a free-flowing type document that reads like a story, but chronological. Okay? Use complete, simple sentences and paragraphs. Don't write one paragraph that's like 3 pages long with no breaks in between, if that makes any sense. You want to use, shorter paragraphs. It's easier to read. It's easier to follow. And the words that you use should be simple and easy to understand. And why do you think I keep telling you to use understandable words?
So that it wouldn't complicate the report or the investigation.
Because there's other people who might have a A lower education who might not understand bigger words. So you want it to where it's understandable across the board, whether they're like highly intelligent or not.
Yeah, I mean, so those are good, both good answers. And typically, remember, think about who gets selected on a jury. There are many different, there's people from across the board on a jury, and you don't really know. First of all, maybe English isn't their first language. Or maybe they have a lower education, a higher education, whatever. There's different age groups. There's younger people and there's older people. So because there's such a diverse group, you want to make sure that you're choosing the words that generally people might understand or are easily explainable. So you don't want to, you don't want to break out the dictionary and get these really big long words that people don't understand.
Basically, to avoid language barrier.
Absolutely. You want to make sure that everybody that, that most who read it would kind of understand it. And then another thing in your style for your report is eliminate needless words, meaning don't be too wordy. And here's an example that I always use. The car was blue in color. What would be a better way to say that?
The car was blue.
Yeah, the car was blue. Because we already know.
Blue car.
Yeah, we already know that blue's a color. So we don't need to be wordy and kind of say the car was blue in color when we already know that blue is the color. So the car was blue. So, shortening up these sentences and being a little bit more factual is better, because the report is meant to inform and communicate information and not really to impress the reader. You're not out to sell this report on, the best book of the year club or something like that. You want it to flow nicely and read nicely, but you're really trying to just get information to everybody. So again, keep it simple, use plain understandable English. Look at words that if you had to explain them. So like examples, infuriated. Some people might know what that means and some people may not. And, and then what does that actually look like? So if you were to go to court and you wrote in your report, the suspect was infuriated, how would you explain that when the defense attorney goes, well, officer, what does infuriated look like or mean? So you know what I mean? Outraged, furious, incensed. Other ones that are easy, angry, mad. Those are easy. Those are easier to kind of figure out. So just, you have to look at those words because you might have to explain them. So that's the importance of using, being concise, being thorough, and then, check your spelling and watch spell check, because even though you're typing in a Word doc a lot of times, you can misspell a word and spell check won't catch it because it might be a different spelling or something. So you just have to, kind of make sure that you're keeping an eye on that. Other abstract wording to look at or to think about would be things like uncooperative. And so instead of saying, well, let's look at the words first. Uncooperative, intoxicated, depressed, angry, belligerent. These are abstract words where you might have to explain them. So in your report, it might be good to describe what makes the person uncooperative. Like the subject, the suspect or the subject, whatever your department likes you to call the person. When I went to grab his hand, he pulled away from me and punched me in the stomach, or what, or whatever. You describe the movements of the individual, which helps you come up with the fact that they were uncooperative. Does that kind of make sense to everyone? So a lot of times it's easier. Same with intoxicated. The suspect looked intoxicated. I guarantee you, if you wrote that in your report, the defense attorney is going to say, well, what does that look like, officer? So if you wrote some information that described the person that led you to believe that they were intoxicated. I could smell alcohol on their clothing. I saw an open beer can in the center console of the car. They were sweating profusely or a lot. their eyes were red and swollen, etc. Those are things that would lead you to believe the person was intoxicated. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So just take the time. If you use these words, make sure you explain them or give some description to add to those words so people understand what you mean. So again, don't simply state the suspect was uncooperative and belligerent. Explain what you mean in order for the person to draw the conclusion that they were belligerent. Like, what did they do? I always kind of think about it that way. So if you looked at a picture like this, you would have to describe it. You wouldn't say here the person's obviously combative, but what were they doing to make them combative? Okay, same with this picture here. This person is obviously a little belligerent and vocal. So if you put that in your report, you would describe exactly what they were doing. Same with this right here. So you would have to just be descriptive in your writing, so that way the jury that reads that would draw the same conclusion that you would. Okay, some other principles that are important for report writing would be, it's better to use first person singular style writing in your crime and arrest reports, meaning use I instead of this officer. A lot of new officers that we get out of the academy, a lot of times they will say, this officer responded to the scene. Well, why don't you just say I? Because you are I. Does that kind of make sense? So I responded to the scene. It's easier. So first person is a lot better when it comes to writing. So an example, I arrived on scene at 3 p.m. and observed or saw, you can use either one of those words, the victim, Mr. Smith, standing on the porch of that residence or house. Either one of those can work. A lot of departments also like you to write in the past tense when you're writing reports, because typically the incident occurred before you completed your report. Like a burglary report, it's already happened. It's already kind of in the past. So your report is basically recounting events that have already transpired, and thus past tense would be appropriate in those types of situations. You could write more in that singular person if you actually observe something happening at the time. I saw the suspect running from the liquor store. That would be appropriate. But typically your reports a lot of times are past tense, because whatever it is that you're investigating has already taken place. Chronological order. Put your information in chronological order, even if you need to make little notes or headings. And a lot of department reports, they use headings. And it's easier to write with headings instead of one large, huge narrative, to have different headings in your narrative report. But put your information in chronological order because it's easier for the reader to follow. State what events occurred first, and then kind of move forward on how things unfolded in a sequential order. And a lot of officers struggle with where to start their report. So if you write in chronological order, it's going to help you. So typically, on any report call, what would be the first thing that happens? Or what would you think would be the first thing that would happen? You're driving around in the field, drinking your Slurpee or your cup of coffee or whatever you got going.
A call's been made.
Yeah, you're going to get a call from dispatch that says, hey, you, Adam 12, for Lincoln 5, or whatever your call sign is. Respond to this place, contact this person regarding a burglary report. So what do you think the first heading is going to be? I got a call to go here about this. That's going to be kind of your first heading there. So it could be, on this date, at this time, I received a call to respond to 123, Willow Avenue regarding a residential burglary report. That would be your very first thing. And we'll kind of look at a couple of, I think I have some examples if I didn't show you some examples of reports, but I'll show you some more. So, but headings help. Next, use your active voice instead of passive voice when you write. So putting things in the active voice is kind of a fairly easy process. First, identify the action of the sentence, then identify who or what is performing the action, and then finally put who or what is performing the action in front of it. And I'll give you an example. So when you use an active voice, put who before the what. Sergeant Smith placed the knife into evidence. Okay, you have the who and then the what. What you want to avoid is the one below that. The knife was placed into evidence. What's wrong with that sentence?
Nobody knows who
Right.
puts the knife into evidence.
Yeah, you're missing the who. So, I mean, it's not a bad sentence. The knife was placed into evidence. That's okay. But if you just left it like that and went on with your report, somebody's going to come back and figure out, well, officer so-and-so, I see that the knife was placed into evidence. Yes, that's correct. Well, who did that? Well, officer so-and-so. Well, it doesn't say that. So it's always important to make sure that the person that's doing the action goes first and then the action goes next. So who before the what. Be objective when you see things. Make sure your statements are factual, using the 5 senses that you can write using these. So what you saw, what you heard, what you said, what you smelled, and what you touched. These are all things that you can write about. If you pull somebody over and they're under the influence, are you going to smell alcohol? Probably. You probably will. Or you saw something happen, or you picked something up, or so these are all objective things that you can use. If possible, use the names and titles of people or individuals involved, because it gets very convoluted. So a couple of examples. I interviewed suspect 1 who stated, and then they gave a statement, versus I interviewed the suspect, John Black, who stated. Can you see the difference? Because if you just use like numbers, you're going to have something that might end up like, I first talked to suspect 1 who told me that he struck victim 1, blah, blah, blah. So you're going to have all these numbers. And it's going to get very confusing when you're talking about suspect 1, suspect 2, victim 1, victim 2. But if you use the second way, I interviewed the suspect, John Black, who stated blah, 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 then you know who that person is. So that's a good way, if possible, use the name of the person. And then you don't have to say the full name every time. You can just use the person's last name if there's nobody else with the last name of Black. So you can say, suspect Black continued by saying, you don't have to say suspect John Black every time.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry, I missed the first part of what you said, but when we are mentioning victim 1, victim 2, would we say victim 1 and then the first name and then like start using the last name? Or do we not say victim 1 at all and just say I witnessed this person and then start using the last name?
That's a great question. And depending upon what agency you work for, they might have you say, and again, it's kind of agency to agency, they might have you say, I interviewed suspect 1, Black, who said. So that could be. What we just want to get away from is always just using numbers, because then it gets really.
Yeah, I get that part because it does get.
Yeah,
it gets. I was trying to figure out how would you recommend obtaining it, but it would be suspect 1 and then the name.
It can be, or it can just be suspect John Black. It can be either one. They're both they're both acceptable.
Thank you.
Sure. Oh, that's fine. But you can see the example here. Suspect 1 stated that suspect 2 had bought the gun and shot victim 1. And you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh. And that's very confusing for the reader on who it is. So that's why using names, last names especially, isn't a bad idea. So here, if you were to clean this up, I mean, depending upon your department, it could be suspect 1 Black stated that suspect 2 Jones had bought the gun. So I mean, that at least you know who you're talking about now. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I've always used the last names, but I was doing it as like in the first wave. I interviewed suspect 1 and then said the last name and then continue on that way.
Mhm.
But I never thought to just say, oh, I interviewed, the last name and then continue doing that. I always try to put numbers on them as well, just so it wouldn't get confused on who I interviewed first.
And that's good as long as the good part is as long as you're using a name in there, so it makes it clear to people that are reading who is who, because just numbers make it tough. So you're fine with suspect 1 Jones or victim 2, Martinez or whatever. That's okay. But having a name in there just makes it easy to follow or easier to follow. Your textbook kind of gives an example, and this is, it's not perfect, but it's okay. They prefer, or they like, suspect Black stated that his friend, suspect Jones, bought the gun and shot the victim, Tom Dugan. So they use full names. When I used to write reports, I would write it like you were just talking about. I would always use the number, but with a name to go with it. What we're just trying to do is avoid all numbers. Okay, so once you've kind of identified the players, suspect 1, John Black, you can stop using suspect or victim and just use their names if you want, if your department will allow you to do that. Some agencies will have you continue with suspect Black or victim Dugan, or suspect 1 Black or victim 1 Dugan. Again, it kind of depends on the agency. I think the textbook is just trying to get across, and my kind of experience says, don't just use numbers, put a name after the number, at least a last name, so that way we can kind of follow it better. Kind of moving on, talking quickly about quotes. The use of quotes is something that you want to use sparingly, and when you need it for effect or where you really think it's important. So use quotes when the suspect's statement is incriminating, or you would really lose the impact of the statement without it. So if the suspect made a threat, I'm going to do this, that would be something that you would want to put in quotes, whether the threat was to another person or to you or something else. So, quotes, don't quote everything. You can summarize a lot of things, but quote those important, impactful statements that you believe need to be quoted. Again, use quotes when the suspect, victim, or witness makes a statement that results in a refusal, denial, consent, or waiver of confession. So if you tell the suspect to do something and they said no or F off or whatever, that would be a good thing to say in quotes, because you would want to be able to say to the jury, when I told the suspect to do A, here's what they said, quote, F off or whatever. So that's a good thing to do. Or a denial, do this, and the suspect said, whatever he said. Consent. Why is it good to put consent in a quote, do you think? Consent meaning that they're going to allow you, or they're going to allow you to do something. Any ideas?
In case it goes over.
Yeah, so it's important for waiver of rights, definitely. But if you're going, let's say you ask for consent to search their car, whatever their response is, I would put in quotes, because that's an impactful statement that you would be able to tell the jury. When I asked, the suspect if I could search their trunk, the suspect said, quote, yeah, go ahead, I don't care, or whatever they said. So that would be an impactful thing. So all of those are important, and especially I think a couple of you said it, anytime there's a waiver of rights, you definitely want to put that in a quote, exactly what they said. That's really important. And then hopefully you're also recording that waiver as well. Use quotes to avoid using subjective statements like the suspect used profanity. So we want to capture their words. So in your report, you don't want to say the suspect cussed me out or the suspect used profanity, because the first thing somebody's going to ask you is, well, what did they say? So there's nothing wrong with putting whatever they said in quotes. Does that kind of make sense? And yes, depending upon what it is, you may have to say the quote in court. So be prepared that if you don't typically use profanity, you may be called upon in a court setting to actually testify to what the person said, and that might be profanity. So just, it's important to kind of understand what you're getting yourself into. Use quotes when using your own words sound improper. This helps when dealing with things like sex crimes. An example, a young child might say the suspect touched my whatever it is, and you may have to use quotes for that. So because you don't really know what they're going to say, you may have to kind of explain what the child thinks that whatever that is. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? So quotes are impactful again. Don't use them all the time for a big long statement, but typically when you want to show something specific like this, you're going to want to use quotes. Run-on sentences. This is one of the most common errors in a police report, where I used to review a report as a sergeant, and it would be, let's say, a 5-page report, and I'd flip the first page and it was one massive paragraph. The entire page was a giant rectangle. There were no gaps, no headings, and it was and the sentences would go on and on with like 17 commas, and it was like, oh my gosh. So watch your run-on sentences. These are the type that go on very long without kind of helping to clarify the events being described. Don't use 10,000 commas, and I know those are subjective. You probably learned that in your English courses. They can be very subjective, but shorten to the point to where you can explain what you're trying to say, but don't, one sentence shouldn't be a paragraph long. So that's probably enough on that. Police jargon. We talked a little bit about that. Be careful of using police jargon. Law enforcement officers, military, etc. They have unique words and phrases that are appropriate to use during certain activities in their daily routine. So if you're working narcotics, you might have slang words or things like that. Or if you're working gangs, you might have, different jargon. It's kind of a hybrid language, but it's used for a specific audience, typically other law enforcement folks. The average person may not understand what you're talking about. So, remember who your audience is when you're writing your reports. It's not just for your fellow police officers. It's court officials, attorneys, jurors, civilian folks need to be able to look at your report and understand what you mean. And I kind of threw these in there. Cops use codes, and you don't put codes in your report. So you're not going to say on this date and time, I responded to a 1086, because people don't know what that is. So I threw up some of Riverside County Sheriff's 10 codes. Codes are for a reason. They're basically so people don't, the average individual may not understand what you're saying, because it might be confidential information. So instead of the dispatcher saying, hey, officer so-and-so, the suspect you have stopped has a $20,000 warrant for forgery, and then they run away. They'll tell you, hey, officer so-and-so, 1035, and you know that means, hey, it's something confidential. I should turn my radio down and step away for a second and hear what they're telling me, and then come back and do whatever I have to do. So a lot of different codes, but we don't write in code. They even have 11 codes. So there's 10 codes, 11 codes. There's all these different types of codes. But they're not going to be in your report, typically. Same with the phonetic alphabet. You're not going to write in the phonetic alphabet. This is typically how you would spell something for your dispatcher. So if you were going to run a name of somebody, because a lot of times the spelling on some names can be difficult, you would spell it to the dispatcher phonetically, but these are things that you won't find in your report. So abbreviations, avoid them. Do your best to avoid them, because a lot of individuals don't know what that means. So if you write a report and you recover methamphetamine, don't say that you found a baggie of meth, because that's kind of jargon. That's a slang. It's an abbreviation, and people don't know what that is versus methamphetamine. So a lot of agencies, have policies and procedure manuals that discourage you using abbreviations. The same with police jargon. Not every reader is going to understand the meaning of every abbreviation that you might throw in there. You might know what it means, but they certainly won't know what it means. We talked a little bit about this. Avoid overcomplicated and sophisticated wording. The object is to communicate information clearly and precisely as possible. So here's kind of a quick example. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that Mr. Lasher was using ambiguous phrases and elusive terminology. I suggested that he should take a moment and compose his equilibrium and then continue with the interview. Okay, and I mean, I know it's kind of like corny, but that's like, people may not understand all of that. Elusive, equilibrium, exacerbated. I mean, come on. Those are words that are just, they're those $20 words, if you will, that you really don't need. Maybe something simpler. So remember, the situation was exacerbated. Initially, Mr. Lasher was unable to speak effectively. I suggested he take a minute and continue in simple language or words. I mean, you can make it mean the same, but just, kind of make it so everybody can understand exactly what it is that you're talking about. Avoid subjective wording if possible. You may have to use it every once in a while, but stay away from value judgments and give brief factual details. Sometimes objective wording might be essential, but here's a couple of examples for that. Mr. Jones had a motive to kill his wife, as he had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on her 2 weeks prior to her murder. So, a little bit kind of subjective, the first one, because you're basically saying that, hey, this guy had a motive to kill his wife because he took out a policy 2 weeks prior to her being killed. Now, that in your mind, that might be true. But example 2, I discovered that Mr. Jones had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy from the Acme Insurance Company on his wife 2 weeks prior to her murder. So, when you look at something that's subjective, the subjectivity says that, hey, he's got a motive to kill his wife. Now, you may think that, but this one's more factual, because basically he did take out a policy before his wife was killed. Those are the facts. Does that kind of make sense? It's not subjective. Okay. Another example, I observed Mr. Jones hiding behind the teller's counter of the bank. Fearing for my safety and the safety of others, I drew my service sidearm and ordered Mr. Jones to drop the gun. Now, what makes this statement a little bit different in being subjective is it's kind of okay now because it's something that you're observing. Okay, not something that somebody is telling you. So every once in a while, subjectivity is okay, but try to stay away from it a little bit. And then finally, avoid conclusions if you can help it. What you observe is a fact, a conclusion, or a deduction based on an observation is a guess, an opinion, or an assumption. So take the time to describe what the person's doing to avoid that. So here's an example. I saw the suspect breaking into the house. It's pretty generic, but it's very subjective because you don't have any details, right? You're assuming. Example 2, I observed the suspect with a screwdriver wedged between the front door lock and the door frame. I observed the suspect making a prying motion on the door lock, which appeared to force the door open. That's more factual, and that is less subjective because it's more factual information, which really anybody can read and figure out, hey, I think he was breaking into the house. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? So you just want to, don't be too subjective in things unless you have some facts to kind of back it up. Proofreading is super important. Once you've proofread your report, revise it as you need to, but proofread it, which means go back through it. And a lot of times what I used to do is I would read it out loud to myself, because you can hear things that don't sound right. And a lot of times that would help. When you do a report, again, sometimes it's easier to print the report out to do this. Review your wording and grammar. Does your report really paint the picture that you want it to paint? And then remember, spell check is okay, but it doesn't catch everything. So just know that spell check isn't always perfect. Always remember that you're not the judge and jury. Your mission is not to prove a subject's guilt per se, but to gather facts and let the judicial system determine the outcome of the whole thing. So your report, you have to report all the facts of the case, not just those that point in one direction. And then be very, very careful, as we talked about Brady, at the very beginning of this lecture, to understand that you want to be factual with stuff like this. You want to make sure if you have exculpatory information that shows somebody might be innocent, you want to put that information out there. So it doesn't mean you're going to lose your case, but you don't want to get caught not putting that information out there. Okay, so that's kind of going to complete our first little lecture. I want to do a kind of a little investigative lecture after this. It won't be very long, but I figured what we do, since you're probably in a coma after about 60 minutes right now, we'll give you about a 10-minute break. We'll come back at like 8:10 or so, or 8:10, 8:12, and then we'll jump into the second part, which shouldn't take too long. But I want to make sure that you get that information as well. So let's take let's come back at about 8:12, and we'll start back up.